Dave will start out today. He, as he said, is at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's a scientist in the Climate and Global Dynamics Laboratory there. And he received his PhD from the University of Colorado in Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences. And then he did a postdoc at the University of Reading in the UK. And he's been at NCAR since 2003. Dave will talk about, he will give an update on permafrost modeling and Earth system models. Our second speaker is Charlie Koven from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He's a scientist there and focuses on Earth system science. Charlie got his PhD from the University of California in Berkeley, and he did a postdoc in France at LSCE. I'm never quite sure what this stands for. It's such a long acronym. And he has been in Berkeley since 2010. Charlie's focus is on high latitude feedbacks to climate change, in particular soil carbon and permafrost. And he will talk today about towards better benchmarking of permafrost processes in Earth system models. And he will use an example, he will use soil carbon turnover as an example. I would suggest that we hear both presentations and then have questions and answers at the end after Charlie's presentation. Okay, Dave, if you don't mind.
Take care of the screen.
Yes, you should be, yeah.
Okay, you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I am going to give this first presentation about the permafrost climate carbon feedback and how we are sort of current progress and where we're at in terms of representing this in Earth system models. And thanks to Charlie, Dave McGuire, Merritt Tresky, Sean Swenson, and Andrew Slater for some of the slides here. Okay. Oops. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start off with motivation, which I expect most people are aware of, but I want to put it into a slightly larger context of the whole sort of the Earth system modeling framework and why we are trying to understand the permafrost carbon feedback. So on the left shows actually a model result from a very recent model, the Community Land Model version 5. That's the model that I helped develop and coordinate the development of. And we just released this version, and this shows a plot of the total ecosystem carbon as simulated by the model in the year 1850. And what you see is this is one of the first models that actually able to capture, the permafrost carbon, soil carbon stocks that exist at high latitudes. And we know that's a lot of carbon. I'm sure all of you are aware of this. It's more than 1,700 petagrams of carbon that's stored in those soils, and that's, if you want to equate that to what's in the atmosphere, that's more than twice as much carbon as is in the atmosphere currently. So clearly, as we see warming, and we expect permafrost thaw to happen with that, and there's projections that there will be substantial permafrost thaw, especially at high emission scenarios. A big question, the open question, is how much of that carbon will be released to the atmosphere and thereby amplifying global climate change. And so the key issue here is that permafrost climate carbon feedback was not represented in any of the CMIP5 models. And so that's what we've been working on for the last several years. And so CLM actually does have a representation, but I want to put this into the context of other processes that are happening in terms of carbon cycle processes in the Earth system model. So this is a zonal average. If you take that, the plot on the left, and then you do a zonal average, and then you look at the change through time. So back in the early part of the record, and say the 1850s up to 1950, we were seeing losses of carbon. Our model was projecting there were losses of carbon throughout the system. That's mostly due to land use change. So as people start convert forests to cropland, we lose those forests and carbon is emitted to the atmosphere. Then starting around 1950 and up to present day, there's been a transition while land use change is still going on. The CO2 fertilization effect started to kick in, and we start to see carbon accumulating on land up into the present day. And then if you make a projection out in the future, we see that for most of the world, carbon continues to accumulate in our model due to the CO2 fertilization effect in combination with warmer climates that are more amenable to plants growing. So we do see up here on the upper right here is a loss of carbon, and that's due to the permafrost climate carbon feedback. And this here is the first global Earth system model that would be sort of capturing this effect. So the big question is, how strong is this loss of carbon? It's really the only place on the planet we're expecting to see large-scale losses of carbon out in the future. Okay, so how are we doing in terms of modeling permafrost? I said we weren't really doing it in CMIP5. This is the plot that we often show, which shows sort of the sorry state of the situation in terms of modeling permafrost in the CMIP5 models, now about 5 years old, 5, 6 years old. Basically what you see is which is just showing the time series of integrated permafrost extent from 1850 out to 2100 under the RCP 8.5 scenario. What you can see is the models showed almost no agreement in anything. You could get models that had essentially no permafrost, 3 million square kilometers, to models that had 30 million square kilometers. Observations put it to 15 to 16 million square kilometers. So a huge range of models performance. The models all do indicate that permafrost will degrade, and there'll be less permafrost in the future, but we clearly don't have much confidence. In Charlie's paper, we were able to identify some issues related to how the models represent snow, how the models represent soil thermal processes, how they represent freeze-thaw processes that were primarily responsible for this large divergence, in addition to the fact that there's climate biases in these couple of models. So that was the state of play for the CMIP5 models. To try to combat this so we could try to move forward on this, we organized a second permafrost modeling and comparison project under the Permafrost Carbon Network that I co-lead with Dave McGuire and Charlie Koven. And here we did a model comparison project where we ran land-only simulations with models that we called permafrost enabled. So all these models that participated had specifically tried to implement permafrost related processes and carbon processes into their models, as opposed to the CMIP5 Earth system models. None of them really, besides CLM, had tried to represent permafrost. So what you see is that there's still a range of projections of loss. It's not as strong, as diverse as it was in the CMIP5 models, which had a range of 1 to 18 million square kilometers by the year 2100, but it's still pretty broad. Although if we throw out this one model, it's a bit of anomalous, this UW-VIC model, it's relatively tightly constrained at losses of between 6 and 10 million square kilometers by 2100 under RCP 8.5. So then we looked at the carbon cycle projections out of these models, and here the results are very diverse. So the way this works, there was actually about 5 models. Looks like unfortunately I've lost the, I forgot to put which model is which, but in some cases, in some ways it doesn't really matter. These are 5 different models that all tried to represent the permafrost carbon feedback. What we see is a huge range of responses. The top panel there shows the soil carbon loss, and we see one model here, it's actually the TEM model, which shows relatively low carbon loss, about 50 petagrams of carbon all the way out to year 2300. And another model which shows 650 petagrams of carbon loss. So these are massive variations in our projections for the permafrost climate carbon feedback. We also see that these models really diverge a lot in terms of their vegetation carbon response to CO2 increases, the CO2 fertilization effect, and also to the warming climate, growing season length increases and things like that. And some of these things, and you can take these two things together and you get the total ecosystem carbon response. What we see is that about half the models, 3 of the models indicate that there will be a net carbon loss as you go beyond the year 2100 from the permafrost system. But there's 2 of these models are actually indicating either an accumulation or essentially relatively neutral change in total carbon. So it's a huge range in these models, and basically it's putting us in the state of play where what can we hang our hat on? What do we have confidence in? And so this is really a summary slide, although I'm going to go on here, but the summary is the needs we think we have based on this project for permafrost carbon feedback modeling, is we really need to standardize the structural representation of permafrost and carbon. There's certain things we know we need. We need a good snow model that represents snow insulation properly. We need to deal with freeze-thaw processes in a realistic way. We know from the carbon cycle standpoint, we need to represent the vertical distribution of carbon and model that explicitly. We also know that we need to model the vegetation correctly. And in particular, the vegetation response to CO2 increases in a warming climate. And you can just look at this plot right here. There's some of these models which are performing a little bit, somewhat reasonably, gaining, 50 to 100 petagrams of carbon. That's a lot of carbon actually to gain. But some of these models are actually saying they're going to gain up to 375 petagrams of carbon. That's like converting that system into something that looks like the Amazon, if you want to sort of equate that to something. So that model's probably unrealistic and we can throw it out. So what we really need then is to develop data sets and methodologies to benchmark models so we can start really fine-tuning these models and potentially excluding models that are just not plausible. So Charlie's going to talk a little bit about that in the second presentation. In the last few minutes I have here, I'm going to demonstrate two things. One is that we can still use these models, even as imperfect as they are, to assess sensitivities to processes. And then also, I'm going to present a short result about how to represent new processes that are completely unrepresented related to thermokarst that happens when permafrost forms and thaws. So Charlie will talk about the data, and I'll talk about these two things here. Okay, so here's my example I want to say about how we can use these models to help us understand uncertainties. An example is uncertainty related to soil moisture projections. So what I'm showing here is the community Earth system model projections of temperature and the water balance for the average across the entire permafrost domain for RCP 8.5. So on the left, you see the very strong warming you get under that scenario up to 2300, both in the atmosphere and the soils. On the right, you see the predicted changes in precipitation. And one thing to note is that this model and all really Earth system models are projecting an increase in precipitation across the Arctic. And the bottom right panel shows the change in volumetric soil moisture across the permafrost domain. What you see is that, interestingly, even though precipitation is going up, our model is projecting that the soils will actually get drier. And we can basically be able to show in the model, I'm not going to show it here, that what's happening is that if you say on the left here of this sort of schematic, you have permafrost, and then above it you have sort of a saturated zone, and above that there might be an unsaturated zone above the water table. As your active layer deepens, as the climate warms, and if you're sort of, even if your precipitation goes up, you're actually creating more pore space, more available water space for the water to go, and actually you can get surface drying even though the climate has gotten wetter. And then if you lose permafrost completely from a location, you might get that water totally like leaving the grid cell going into the groundwater system. That's what's happening in our model. If you look across the permafrost carbon network models, you see a really, again, a very strong divergence. We have some models that indicate, and I should point out here, all these models are forced with the same climate projection. So some models say it's going to get a whole lot wetter. Some models are going to say it's going to get a whole lot drier. On average, the models indicate that it's going to be drying, but it's really, again, a huge amount of uncertainty. And so we wanted to ask the question then is, what would happen if it actually didn't dry out? And there's some reason to think that it may not actually dry out near the surface. And that's because we know that as ice melts in the permafrost, the soils do subside, and there's evidence of that happening already. As the ground subsides, potentially that sort of increase in pore space that you might have gotten isn't as big, and you might actually get a situation where it's just as wet at the surface as it was before, or possibly even wetter. And so we wanted to ask the question, and this is a map down here on the bottom right showing the projected subsidence by the year 2100 from our model. So we wanted to ask the question then, how much of an impact would this have on the permafrost carbon feedback if the soils didn't dry like our current model is projecting? So we did two experiments. The nice thing about models, you can tell them to do exactly what you want. And so we did two experiments. We did our control experiment, which was where the soils dried. And then we just did another experiment where I didn't allow the soils to dry. And I won't go into how we did that, but we did that in a sort of non-interfering way to allow the carbon cycle to respond to the soil climate exactly the same as before, but the soils stayed wet. What we see is the impact on the ecosystem carbon is that because the soils are wetter under this blue curve here, you don't have as much loss of soil carbon because it's basically an anaerobic situation. The turnover times go down. We don't lose as much ecosystem carbon. So about 18% more carbon is lost when the soils dry. But if you look at methane emissions, we see the opposite signal. We see a big increase in methane emissions if you don't let the soils dry. That's not surprising. There's more wetlands, there's more saturated areas, and so the methane emissions respond to that. And if you add these two things together, we actually find that we get a 50% higher global warming potential if the soils don't dry. So there's an example of a way we can use the model to assess a potential sensitivity. And in this case, it's quite a big sensitivity. The model is quite sensitive to the soil hydrologic state. And then lastly, I want to turn to this big uncertainty in our projections is what is the effect of thermokarst processes on permafrost carbon dynamics. So thermokarst, for those who are not aware, is on the bottom right here, is subsidence of the surface that is caused by the melting of ground ice, leading to fens and bogs or thermokarst lakes or hillside failures. And this is a rapid process. It can happen quite quickly as the soils thaw and the ice melts. And so this is what we're calling in the community refers to this as a pulse response. And contrary to the sort of the top-down thaw where the active layer is deepening and carbon is just being exposed, thermokarst processes can quite quickly tap into deep permafrost carbon, potentially resulting in rapid carbon release. And so currently, or up until very recently, we had no estimate of the magnitude of this loss. Is this something that's going to be essentially negligible on the Pan-Arctic scale, or is this something that's going to be something that we need to consider as an important additional feedback? And so Merritt, Turetsky, and others have gone through this process of trying to estimate this by defining where they think the thermokarst processes might occur under warming, document what happens when the current extent of thermokarst features, and then analyze recent trends to try to get an understanding of how quickly and how rapidly it could happen under warming, and then also analyze observations to assess the impacts of carbon, of these landscape transitions on the carbon dynamics. And so I can't get into the details here, but basically she puts together a relatively simple thermokarst. She calls it a state transition conceptual modeling. This is really trying to get a good back of the envelope estimate. So she says if there's a change in permafrost area that looks like the red line, based on our understanding of what's happened in the past, we can make estimates of what is going to be the increase in flow-through fens, for example, or what's going to be the change in young collapse scars, mature collapse scars, different features of the landscape. We can then take an understanding of what we think the carbon cycle consequences of these are, come up with a change in the carbon balance. And then if you sum it across all these different kinds of situations, and there's like 8 to 10 different ways, you can talk about thermokarst. This is just an example for lowland organic terrain in the boreal region. If you add them all up, she's finding that there's a global warming potential due to the thermokarst of approximately 50% of that we're seeing to active layer thickness deepening. And feedbacks under warming climate are not captured by our state transition approach, which then suggests that one of our big challenges then is to integrate these thermokarst parameterizations into ecosystem models. And that's going to be a really big and challenging job. And so then I'm going to finish there, just put up this slide, which is really also serves as my summary slide. And I think I can turn it over to Charlie.
Thank you, Dave. That was really great. Let's move on to Charlie and then have the questions afterwards. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Christina. Do you see my screen?
It went
Not yet.
Yes, now we can see. Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, so thanks everybody. I want to talk about development of permafrost benchmarks to test ESMs. And I think Dave gave a really nice background on sort of the state of things with those system models. And like Dave, I want to start at sort of the broadest scale and sort of in the context of Earth system models, where are we and how does permafrost fit? And I think that, one of the points he made was that there's sort of a lack of predictive power right now with our particular carbon cycle models that, and I think that's true at the global scale too. If you look across what models predict for carbon cycle feedbacks, they're kind of all over the place, where some models are predicting these large gains, others are predicting these large losses. And I think, on one level, we ask a lot of, in Earth system models of the land surface models. They need to provide both the kind of physics of partitioning of energy and water fluxes, and then also these carbon cycle feedbacks. And so there's a lot of data that's out there, but what has been lacking so far is a systematic benchmarking of the land surface models against a lot of different types of observations. And so one of the things that we've been working on, this project that is being led by Forrest Hoffman and Nate Collier at Oak Ridge, and Dave and I and others have been involved in, is developing this systematic way of benchmarking these land models using this thing we're calling ILAME, the International Land Model Benchmarking. And what this shows here, I apologize for the tiny font size, but basically the idea is, you know, on the columns here are showing a lot of different models that participate in these big intercomparison projects, and the rows are lots of different attributes of the models that we could benchmark. So things like, you know, how much biomass do they have? How much soil carbon do they have? What are their transpiration fluxes or runoff, things like that. So we're trying to sort of think about as many different orthogonal ways of testing these models as possible. And sort of the two different blocks of color here, on the left is sort of, you know, relative to the variability of the observations, how do the models do? So there's some things that all models do poorly or all models do well, and we want to sort of be aware of that. The right-hand box is kind of normalize things by the mean model and to say, well, of the models that are participating, which are the ones that are doing well and which are the ones that aren't doing well for a given metric. And so this is all sort of coming at the global perspective. And I think, you know, one of the things that's needed now is to focus in on some of these high latitude specific things to get at the permafrost carbon feedback benchmarks. And just to reiterate, we need some permafrost specific benchmarks for Earth system models. You know, as Dave said, a lot of the ESMs are focusing on permafrost because it's, you know, it's this possible agent of particularly very strong climate feedback. And we need benchmarks to focus on the critical processes that are likely to affect these ecosystems, both physical and, you know, biogeochemical, carbon, methane type processes. And the last point I think is sort of maybe something I want to focus on is that they're most useful when they allow you to really diagnose specifically something that's wrong with the model. And allow you to sort of attribute these biases to a specific set of mechanisms. And one of the things that we found to be really useful for this is benchmarks that are based on some relationship between different variables in the models. And I'll talk about two examples of how we've been going about trying to construct some of these benchmarks that allow you to really see what the models are doing well or not well. And so there's one is from a paper that Drew Slater wrote, in which, you know, what Drew was getting at here was, you know, that snow obviously is incredibly important for mediating the heat transfer between the atmosphere and the land surface. And where the more snow there is, the more the snow attenuates the amplitude of the seasonal cycle between the surface air temperature seasonal cycle and the snow seasonal cycle. And so what it did is to say, well, okay, we've got observations of this. You go to the met stations, here you use the Russian met stations across Siberia, and looked at the amplitude, you know, of the air surface and then the amplitude of the near surface soil, and defined this metric based on the effective snow mean depth and the fraction of in which that seasonal cycle amplitude gets attenuated by the snow. So that's on the left hand, the observations. Then you can take that exact same relationship between snow depth and then these, you know, this relative attenuation of the seasonal cycle, and apply that to a bunch of different models. And all the different lines here correspond to different models from the CMIP5 in a comparison. So what this shows is that, you know, some models doing a reasonable job, other models just aren't. And so we, you know, allows you to really identify, okay, well, some of these models really need to focus on their snow cycles. You know, a next step, which we haven't done yet, we'd like to do is to make a similar kind of benchmark between, say, the near surface soil temperatures and deeper soil temperatures. You know, I've shown in previous work that models disagree a lot on that. And there's exist data sets out there like the Vladimir's data set and other, you know, these borehole data sets. And a key thing now is to get all this stuff into a sort of metric that we can use to diagnose and benchmark the models. I'm talking about next a metric that I've been working on to look at the temperature effects on soil carbon turnover times. So here what I'm doing is, on the left, I'm taking two big data sets, or two different types of data. One from soil carbon, and then on the left, below that, the NPP, so effectively the inputs of carbon into the soil based on the net primary productivity. For the soil carbon, what I've done is merge two different soil carbon data sets. One, the global harmonized world soil carbon database, and then at high latitudes, because the harmonized world soil database doesn't really have a lot of good info for the permafrost. At least the version that I'd used here didn't. What we did is substituted the Northern Circumpolar Soil Carbon Database that Gustav Hugelius and Charles Tarnakai et al. have been leading for a while. If you take the ratio of those two things, those give you a metric on the soil carbon turnover times globally. And so now the key thing is we want to be able to think about how different processes control this. And so if you're interested in the temperature sensitivity, you want to make one way of thinking about this is we can plot this turnover as a function of the mean annual air temperature, and then look at how this relationship varies globally to get an assessment of the sort of spatial sensitivity. One sort of thing we need to do is say, well, it's not just soil temperature that controls turnover. That soil moisture is also very important, whether soils are either too dry in deserts or sort of very wet in peatlands. And so just to get at the pure temperature response, we first get rid of the soils that are either too wet or too dry, and just look at the residuals. And what you see is that you can calculate this curve. And the crucial thing is, because it's plotted on a log axis for the y, what it says is that the slope of this curve at any given temperature is telling you something about the temperature sensitivity of soil carbon as a function of that temperature. And what you see here is that the temperature sensitivity itself increases as you get to colder climates. And you can sort of explain why you might see this in a really simple way. If you just take the temperature from models and you just evaluate soil carbon decomposition using only the surface temperatures from those models, and sort of put that through this metric, it gives you something that's sort of like this set of black dots, and you don't see this change in slope. Whereas if you, instead of diagnosing the temperature sensitivity of the surface of the soils, you go throughout the soil column and evaluate sort of the mean decomposition rate throughout the first meter in the soil, you get something that then approaches this increase in temperature sensitivity at cold climates. And so what we argue here is that that's sort of why we really need to think about the way in which you represent soil carbon vertically through the soil, is because that actually allows you to get this change in temperature sensitivity just because of the scaling in space and time of freeze-thaw processes in the soils. If you take this metric, you apply it to the CMIP5 generation of models, basically they all fail in one way or another. They all either show this sort of linear response, or possibly the curvature with the wrong shape, or at best maybe like an offset between the sort of permafrost and non-permafrost soils without this sort of without the actual change in curvature. And so this kind of benchmark then becomes useful to say, well, okay, all these models are have done something wrong, and the reason why is because none of them include this vertical scaling of soil carbon processes properly. If in the development of a model like community land model, we then focus on these benchmarks. So going from CLM 4, which didn't do this vertical scaling, to CLM 4.5, which does, and then CLM 5, which continues to, but now we've changed some more of the parameters to increase the sensitivity to moisture as well. We can get a model that sort of does better with successive generations against these kind of benchmarks. And so, yeah, so just to conclude, the land model community is increasingly focusing on permafrost. We need to be systematically testing our models against observations in this sort of a benchmarking way. We've progressed on some initial benchmarks that are informative about specific processes in the models. And we still need to develop more types of benchmarks and better use the information that exists out there from the observational community in order to better constrain the system models. And with that, I will pass back to Christina.
Great, thank you very much. This is really cool. I've seen some of the graphs before, but there's some new ones in there, and that's very exciting. Yeah, this is open now to questions and comments. Please unmute yourself if you are speaking, and mute yourself again when you're not speaking.
My name is Yassine Shorbani. I have a question concerning the permafrost carbon feedback. Actually, it's kind of comments or just an inquiry. So since you use ESM together with CLM to calculate the permafrost carbon feedback, did you have a chance to look at the ocean carbon uptake response time? So how long does it take for the ocean to respond for the increase in carbon emissions, and when this will result in uptake of carbon, and when because we know that the ocean carbon uptake is a very slow process, and this results in lag time, which means we might see an increase in the carbon emission from the permafrost, but this will be sometimes probably offset by the ocean carbon uptake. Could you please comment on this?
Do you want me to try, Charlie, or do you want
to? Sure, you go.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer. I don't do a ton of work on ocean carbon modeling, but I think they're both slow processes. The permafrost carbon release is a very slow process, and the ocean uptake is a slow process. So I don't think it's a super relevant way to think about it. I mean, the question is whether or not our model can reasonably capture the ocean uptake processes, and with caveats, it does okay. Has some problems in the Southern Ocean, as most models do, but in general, it looks like the ocean model is doing a reasonable job. We'll find out. We're about to run the new set of projections with this for the first time in a fully coupled prognostic CO2 simulations over the next 6 to 9 months.
Hi, this is Diana Bull at India National Labs. The potential pulse input from the thermokarst lake formation, adding up to 50% of the warming potential is just the permafrost thaw. What are the aspects in that are the variables that are least understood in terms of capturing that from a modeling perspective? Like, what are the biggest hurdles to understanding how to get that into the models in an appropriate way?
Do you want to try, Charlie?
Yeah. What are you offering again?
No. I mean,
okay, so I'll try on this one. I mean, I think so. So in Merritt's paper, what the approach she's taking is to effectively, sort of say, if we assume that the relationship between the top-down thaw and thermokarst is, has a certain structure, then what would the consequences of that be? And I guess what you're asking is sort of how would we, the long-term goal is to be able to, mechanistically from a process perspective, actually say, well, to trace every, each process that leads to the thermokarst. And I think the real issue there in doing that in a sort of proper mechanistic way is just the scale mismatch, where, thermokarst is particularly sensitive to this really fine scale hydrology, which is just incredibly difficult to represent in these sort of global scale models. And so, we're playing around with trying to think about how to, divide up the grid into various ways in order to get at some of these effects. But it's become very hydrology.
So you don't believe that the same kind of variables of snow and vegetation are playing, et cetera, that you've mentioned previously, are playing in at the same level to the thermokarst lake formation, and that it's really just driven by this kind of balance between subsidence and thaw with the hydrologic processes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hypothesis, and so like Dave showed, approaches to do that, and to include these kinds of subsidence in the models, but we're even farther from being able to have confidence in those than in the large scale processes.
Thank you so much.
I can add to that a big thing in Merritt's paper is considering whether the successional stages after thermokarst initiation, and that's a big part of it. And her current approach, which I think she would acknowledge is simple, but it's getting us at least some sort of an estimate of the magnitude. It doesn't capture the fact that under climate change, the successional stages after you get a thermokarst lake may not be the same anymore in the future. So that's the reason to try to get into a mechanistic model. But I think the other issue, in addition to what Charlie said, is that there's 10 different ways that thermokarst sort of behaves. And each one of them is somewhat a little bit unique. So then you have to try to decide how do you, how many of these processes are we trying to get? Are we trying to get hill slope fossil lumps, thermokarst lakes? What are the most important ones? That's sort of another challenge.
Do we have other questions?
Can I ask on other people thinking? It's Vladimir. Yeah, very great presentations, guys. Thank you. So there's, do you see there's some interesting threshold when permafrost thaw from the top, like increase in active layer, across some threshold when the layer which is thawed during the summer will not freeze completely in the winter, developing this layer of non-frozen soil for the entire year, so-called thallic. So do you see any threshold in relationship between this kind of degradation of permafrost and carbon in any way when this threshold is crossed? The development of thallic.
Yeah, I mean, so we definitely
widespread thallic.
Right. I mean, we definitely see that in the model, right? So that's like in the paper that Nick Parazu led, trying to identify. One of the things that we can do with the models, in addition to sort of make these projections, is to ask, well, if the permafrost carbon feedback were occurring and sort of being triggered by climate change, what would some of the signals associated with that look like? And yeah, in his paper, he definitely identified that the formation of the thallic layers, is the point at which a lot of the grid cells start to switch and become large sources of carbon. Again, whether or not that's true in reality is a separate question, but it's definitely one of the signals that seems to come out of the model.
Thank you. And I have a short comment on snow, this benchmarking snow and amplitude. The curve, you try to kind of approximate all different data, starts with non-zero at zero snow. That shouldn't be, I think. There is no snow, it shouldn't be no decrease in amplitude, or it's maybe some other process you're talking about, amplitude of surface temperature, and may be a little bit different than amplitude in air temperature. And second one, the shape of the curve, it shouldn't go into complete asymptote. I mean, it's still, it still should kind of increase slowly, more like square root of x than something like inverse, well, what it was exponent or something.
Yeah, so I mean, to your first point, yeah, I mean, I think that we do expect there to be some attenuation seasonal cycle, or just, you don't necessarily expect them to be exactly the same. In principle, the seasonal cycle of soils could be larger than the seasonal cycle of air temperature in certain extremes as well, primarily being driven by, radiative processes rather than, conduction from between the atmosphere and the land surface. Right.
It's also 20 centimeters deep, Charlie, or something like that. So there's 20 centimeters of attenuation in that diagnostic. So there should be an offset, actually, I think.
Yeah, and if you look at the measured data, you can imagine it can start at zero, and it is kind of not really getting into the asymptote. So yeah, of course it's yeah, everybody see different shapes and in the same data.
The answer to your second question, Vladimir, is that that's what the data is showing. So he's getting that curve from the data. So if there should be some sort of long tail to the insulation out at high snow depths, we don't have, so that the metric is currently designed would indicate we don't have enough data to robustly define that.
Okay.
But that also probably doesn't matter. I mean, on what really matters is the steepness of the curve at the low snow depths, because that's where you're gonna, you might get a change in your snow conditions, which will then feed back onto permafrost. And if you
That's
get
right.
So.
That's right.
Great, thank you very much.
Hi, guys.
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is Jessica Arnakovich. Thanks for a good talk, both of you. That was really interesting. I was curious because a lot of the lab data shows that methanogenesis has a really long time lag, and I'm wondering whether the models capture that or whether or not that just doesn't matter, because when you are doing your modeling, you're really looking at such long time scales, whereas in a lab incubation, we might be looking at a few months or a few years at best. Curious to your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, so the models, at least the methanogenesis model that we use in the community lab model does not include these lag effects, because it doesn't take into account like the actual decomposer populations of the microbes that are leading to the methanogenesis. And so, it's not something that, right now we're using these kind of pretty simple sort of first order decay based ideas about what controls both oxic and anoxic decomposition. And so no, we're not able to take into account that level of process complexity. Whether or not it matters is, I think it's an open question. I think until we have a really clear understanding of what the implications are of different ways of representing decomposition, whether or not you need to include the decomposer community and the population dynamics of that, it certainly expands the range of possible outcomes. But given that the uncertainty on these processes is already very high, I think it's an open question what, sort of what the right level of process complexity to include in something like, the microbial component of an Earth system model, and B, what those choices about how we construct the models actually means in terms of the model predictions.